Dear colleagues, I'm really sorry about our delay. It was a problem with the links, but now you're here, and I'm really glad that you're here for our afternoon's book launch on Alexej Lochmatow's book, Public Knowledge in Cold War Poland, which is going to be discussed after a short introduction given by Alexej, first discussed by Izabela Wagner and then by Maciej Górny. But first, I'd like to introduce our speakers. And I'd like to start with our author, Alexej, who studied history and cultural and intellectual history, first in Moscow, then in Cologne. A second MA was earned also in Moscow at the Higher School of Economics, and he wrote his PhD at Erfurt University, and then you're melding up in Cologne, but now you're working at Erfurt University. And we are quite curious to hear what you wrote about public knowledge in Cold War Poland. But first of all, I'd like to introduce our commentators. This is Izabela Wagner, who's a sociologist and is working in Paris. But she earned a scientific title of Professor 𝗕𝗁𝗪, which is given by the President of the Republic of Poland. She has been associate professor at the Institute of Sociology at 𝗕𝗁𝗵𝗆 Civitas in Warsaw from 2019 to 2023, and is member of the Unité de recherche Migration et Société and fellow at the Institute Convergence Migration in Paris since 2019. She's focusing on migration, on exile scientists, intellectuals, musicians, and has written a lot of books. And so I'm quite happy that you're here, Izabela, and give a comment on Alexej's book. The second commentator is Maciej Górny, who is a deputy director of research at the 𝗕𝘁𝗁𝗪 Institute of the Polish Academy of Science in Warsaw. And he studied in Warsaw, then history. Then he did his PhD at the 𝗕𝘁𝗁𝗪 Institute. And then he had a long list of grants and research stays, for example, in Leipzig at the Geisteswissenschaftliches Zentrum Geschichte und Kultur Ostmitteleuropas, the 𝗕WZO. And he was member of the PhD program at Berlin and worked, for example, also for the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. He has also written a lot, and one of the key publications is perhaps your expertise on First World War. So I'm really happy that you're here. And now, Alexej, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you. Can you see there? Okay.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and they're thankful to many guests that have come today to this event, and to their commenters, of course, who are the leading specialists in our research field, and to the organizers, 𝗕𝗁𝗪𝗪 and Heidi Hanke here, the Herder Institute. I have just realized that I firstly presented the project that ended with this, with the publication of this book, the research colloquium of the Herder Research Academy in Marburg, and 𝗕𝗁𝗪𝗪 was the one who brought me there. So that is great that we are here today in this very small group. In my very brief introduction, I'm going to say several words on my methodological framework And after that, to briefly introduce you to their historical material, their book at least was supposed to cover. The concept of virtue plays a central role in the book and shapes, in fact, the methodological framework. The concept itself is a highly controversial one, and there were very different things that were understood by that throughout the history. But the most important context of the application of the usage of this concept is usually the field of ethics, or in some cases more specifically, for example, Republican political theory or stuff like that. But generally, in most cases, virtue means a kind of character trait, a positive character trait, which is supposed to be cultivated to make a person good in terms of certain normative systems, or more specifically to make a person capable of doing good things in various life situations, more or less independently or autonomous. Intellectual historians and the historians of science used this concept in a slightly different context, and develop the context of so-called epistemic virtue, which was in fact a part of a bigger program on of research on the moral economy of science. That means a set of conventions and norms that make which determine what does it mean to be a good scholar or good scientist in this or that historical epoch. And I think that the most important thing about this tendency, which is not that new, I mean, in various forms it existed at least since the 90s, but what is especially important about it, in my view, is that not the ideas themselves, but the social conventions and kind of social contexts of their production, of the production of knowledge, became the central issue of this kind of scholarship. And in fact, it meant to be a kind of marriage between the history of ideas and social history. And I found this as a kind of ambition very intriguing and interesting. Of course, virtue is still a very idealist concept, and always applies kind of imperative that prescribes how things should be rather than how they are in the reality. So historians can analyze discourses about virtues and their practices of their cultivation. But at the same time, the public manifestations of this virtue, so what actually people who think they are acting in accordance with virtue do, can be very different, and the spectrum of this difference can be very broad. This makes the usage of this concept a very complex task, but it does mean that it is not useful. And as a historian, I'm always suspicion of everything that is too logical or too schematic. And in this case, that is good that it is not the case with this approach, at least. So I thought that the spread of the Soviet dominance, or the dominance of the Soviet Union in Central and Eastern Europe after the Second World War can provide us with rich material for reflections on this kind of issues. And it is clear that science and scholarship in the Soviet Union at least was supposed to be conducted in accordance with very specific virtues, and as it was claimed, had to radically oppose the norms and conventions of the so-called bourgeois science. It required people to adopt in fact, new academic ethos, which couldn't go out without problems, of course. I started to deal with this period and concretely with the issue of the Stalinization of Poland in my bachelor thesis a couple of years ago. And from the very beginning, I was much more interested in the things about the so-called Stalinization that didn't work out. So this book is a result of the attempt to bring together my interests, my theoretical interest in the history of science and scholarship, and the outcome of my long-term studies and partly students' studies on Sovietization, Central and Eastern Europe. It was the ambition of this book to develop a kind of theory of virtue, even though in the meantime I think much more about social psychological aspects of virtues in their historical development that can be seen as a kind of theory. But anyway, this book proposed to use virtue just as a kind of lens, as something that can help us to look at the familiar things from a new perspective. And an interesting thing about the so-called Sovietization was also that it applied overcoming the separation between political or civic and academic or scholarly or scientific virtues, which makes this example relevant also for more general scholarship of virtues in the history of science and scholarship, for example. It was the task of the core task of the activists of Sovietization to make progressiveness, partisanship, the loyalty to their working class in a very specific form, and so on, both scientific and political virtues. That is a very important point. Another important issue is that the utopian task of Stalinization was to make scholars and scientists, to some extent, autonomous in performing good, correct science and scholarship. That is exactly what virtues are about, and they should make an individual autonomous in acting in accordance with certain normative system. That is a paradox about the whole discourse of virtues, which combines very paternalistic logic and this idea of reaching autonomy at the end. It is very simple to illustrate this point on the concrete examples from my book. At the highest point of Stalinization in the early 50s, during the first Congress of Polish Science, the academic officials repeatedly said that nobody expects scholars and scientists to say something that officials want them to say. They had to come to the correct views to conducting correct science and scholarship, performing themselves. For example, the geographer and same deputy, 𝗪𝗪 𝗪𝗪𝗪 said during one of the discussions within this Congress that if academic discussion were directed by politicians, there would be no need of conferences or conventions like that. The aim of the Congress is not to write reports for the authorities, but to specify errors, to conduct mutual criticism, and to come to the correct views for this new procedure. So scholars were supposed to become autonomous in performing this correct science and scholarship. This idea was a leitmotif in the post-war period, but of course the degree and the character of control over the public manifestations of virtues were different. And in this regard, the early post-war period, a few years following the Second World War, plays a very important role in my book. Unlike Czechoslovakia or Hungary, the regime in Poland was directly established by the Soviet authorities, in fact, but still Poland was considered a very difficult case in terms of making it communist, and the strategy of the authorities was a very careful one. One can say that progressiveness was claimed to become the central virtue that every scholar and scientist was supposed to adopt under the new realities. One was invited to purify her or himself from reactionary elements and cultivate progressiveness and so on. But the point was that a strict control over their manifestations of these virtues was not established yet. And only one example of this kind of uncontrolled quest for progressiveness was the public attack on the so-called dogmatic Marxism, kind of read Soviet Marxism in the public sphere. Just to take one example, the prominent sociologist 𝗖𝗹𝗱 𝗪𝗶 in the late 40s, in the 1947, in the series of publications from the late 40s, which were published in 1947, 48, publicly wondered that this kind of dogmatic Marxism still was an issue in the academic agenda, and anthropologically examined Marxists as a kind of religious group that mobilize all resources for fighting intellectual progress. And he referred to 𝗕𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗪 and claimed that, in fact, in this case, the Marxian doctrine has a very religious function in terms of strengthening the integrity of a social group of Marxists, of followers of this ideology, and supporting the idea of the infallibility of the authority figures who are the guarantors of this doctrine. So to be progressive in accordance with this knowledge, in accordance with this logic, one had to overcome this form of Marxism. He wrote also many positive things about Marx and Engels themselves. Of course, this period, the period in which this kind of discussions in the press was possible, was very short one. During the wave of Stalinization, the authorities tried to develop the mechanisms of strict control over the public manifestation of ideas and virtues as well. One had to be progressive in the correct way. It was important to create kind of situation in which the new moral economy could get its relevance. So there were congresses or big conventions at which scholars and scientists had to claim their unity. There were ideological campaigns that were meant to force scholars and scientists to change their mind, not only to be progressive in a correct way, but also to adopt more specific virtues such as partisanship or loyalty to the working class in very specific and distinct form. But all this had to be a kind of autonomous action of academics. They were expected to do it together. And this new moral economy was supposed to work only if the majority of actors accept the roles of the play. This wasn't the case. And even though the censorship was reformed and started to strictly remove everything that was more or less ambiguous from the public sphere. Their documents are within various formats of these congresses and conventions show that the Concordia and this common agreement was not achieved. And the established scholars and societies continued to defend their standards of good academic practice and their kind of forms of virtuous behavior. They argued, for example, that tolerance towards other opinions is a kind of cornerstone of any good academic practice. The sociologist 𝗕𝘁𝗹𝗱, whom I mentioned above, said during one of their discussions on them in the early 50s that the mobilization of intellectual forces is impossible without freedom of discussion. One who cuts down an apple tree in order to pick apples as quickly as possible doesn't follow the rules of rational production. Moreover, in the printed texts, many of those academics who were publicly attacked could respond to the criticism, and even at the highest point of Stalinism and Stalinization. Like, for example, the philosopher Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz, who wrote also in the 50s that criticism of those who attacked him publicly didn't convince me of the need to revise any of my opinions. Rather, Marxists can learn from me and to find some arguments for their theories in my works. I think that the fact that this circle wasn't closed and the new moral economy wasn't established played a very important in the later post-war history of Polish academia, and not only academia, more generally the intellectual agenda of the post-war Poland. Most importantly, the young activists of Stalinization joined the struggle against the virtues that were promoted under Stalinism. Not to idealize the story, I would like to emphasize that had an enormous influence on how academia worked under these conditions. And one can say that it, in fact, distorted scholar practice in the countries under Soviet domination. I think that one of the against it happened under the banner of national virtues, which were mobilized for the struggling, everything that was considered foreign and could be labeled foreign. The necessity to be good in terms of this national resistance to everything that was supposed to be foreign, to struggle against this foreign not point. This made many issues regarding progressiveness, or, for example, an idea of socially engaged scholarship, at least secondary, and in some cases led to labeling everything that is connected with it as something that was brought by the Soviet Union, which had long-term consequences and in most radical and kind of absurd form. It played, for example, a central role in the official discourse under the peace rule. Concluding, I can say that I try to make a mythological statement with this book and to develop kind of logic or approach that can be applied also to different cases and contexts. But at the same time, I try to make this book readable also for those who are not interested in my mythological reflections. It was a very interesting time. It was probably a horrible time, but still there were very interesting people who said and wrote interesting things, despite or even due to their conditions under which they had to exist. Thank you for listening. By the way, I wanted this picture to be on the cover of my book, but the publisher has its own, how to say, sense of beauty.
Yeah, you see, see it. Okay, thank you very much. And the first commentator is Izabela. The floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really happy that I had possibility to read this book, and I just before I would like to tell you from which perspective I will speak, and I read this book. So I worked as a sociologist. I investigated several years the career of researchers. And it was not only the people in a present time, and I started with biology people. So when I read your book, I had this feedback from what I heard from geneticians and the oldest generation, and they remind the Stalinization and the process that you describe, but in genetics. So I was lucky to mobilize this kind of knowledge. Also, I'm speaking today because I read this book from the perspective of the history of science in my fascination of, with Fleck's work. And also, I think that we can start all this story with this statement that in Poland we had rich discussion before World War II about the what 𝗕𝗁𝗫𝗁 called the social role of scientists or of men of knowledge, 𝗕społeczne role uczonych. It was this famous paper which I think was discussed, reflected by all this generation of people that amazingly resisted to the Sovietization. And that was, for me, I would say that starting your book, I was very suspicious because as an ethnographer, someone who spent a lot of years in the laboratories and in the scientific, actually life science laboratories, all these virtues, values, and all this belongs, in my opinion, to the discourse. And discourse are not practices, yes, as you know, but you convinced me that it's really worthy to take this challenge and to go, and I followed you, and I had no in hesitation. So this is my really congratulations, and I'm very enthusiastic about this book because I was not very open to this approach, and you convinced me that this approach gave a new vision of what happened with this process of Stalinization and its failure, actually. And probably today, certainly, I would say without this, acts, we cannot approach this process because the core of it was based on this discourse on values. So thank you very much for this. This is a new reading for me. Another very important point, and I wish to emphasize, is that rarely we have the analysis, historical analysis, provided by foreigner people, and sorry for this foreign, but you are not Paul, and speaking and approaching what happened there in Warsaw, in Poland, from abroad. It's a very interesting and good point. My former PhD directors, or my PhD director, who published amazing book about Chicago tradition. This is the reference book, one of the best book on Chicago tradition. He is French, and he spoke from, French perspective. And he saw a lot of things that United States scholars completely omitted. And your distance brought us this vision, open up this vision that French side was very important, which is frequently omitted when we are discussing, or someone could perhaps add that it was other influences, but you emphasize this French intellectuals, French communists, engaged intellectual communists, how they were important in the first phase, just after the war, but also in this reaction, actually not very positive reaction to the changes, yes, to the 56. And I will not go into details. If you wish, we can pursue after. But it was for me very important what you brought and what you discussed, this in-betweenness in which Poland was always stuck in, and sometimes forget about it. I think that here we can really get a lot of reflection. I just one example, for example, Julian Hochfeld. He was absolutely educated also in France. Not only his British connections were brought up, but he was absolutely Francophone, educated here. And his perspective on Marxism and of left engagement was very much French style. And I think that you showed it amazingly, and how he navigated in between the imposition and this Stalinism that grew up, and how he resisted in this duality, trying to keep his opinions at least in a circle of students. Yes, at least that was very important also to remember that we had this double language, in a sense that officially the scholars were obliged to admit and enter into the imposed value, yes, recognize them, even if the biggest authorities could deny or could resist. Other people, they did it, however, in a other sphere, which were smaller, restricted. They continue to be open to this occidental French or other scholars' influences, and that was something I think that should be remembered. And you showed with also, I appreciated a lot your focus on Christian intellectuals. Or why? Because we have these ideas that the milieu was homogenic, means that it was only Christian versus lefty people or secular people, and inside of each environment we had different groups, and inside of these groups and individuals, that I appreciated a lot also, that you show the dynamics, means people like Hałasiński that changed his camps, etc. So I will not take a lot of time for discussing it, but I'm very grateful for your book. And with other last elements that I would like to emphasize, which could be perhaps surprising for you or not at all. I will be curious about other people's feedback, because starting from second page, I think I thought immediately about present situation. And don't blame on me that I'm living 56 or those years. And here I'm speaking as a sociologist and anthropologist of present time. And the struggle which we have in academia now, which is, I don't know the situation in your environment, in Germany or in Poland, but here in France, we are completely stuck. And this political correctness, the lefty camps in front of the situation in the Middle Orient, for people who are familiar with the history and familiar with the, let's say, ethnographic insiders of these territories, knows very much complexity, and what is imposed by academic approach to not academic approach, just this is a problem. This is religious approach, as 𝗖𝗂𝗪 said, with the ideologies, and we cannot escape it. And this is much more visible, those ideological declaration, faith, etc. It is taking a lot of spaces, and we have no more space for academia. So when I read your book, I thought all the time about this version of feminism, this version, what we say here, campism, which is preventing us doing just scholarly work and just keeping our diversity and discussion. So I took your book also as a optimistic story, because we know that the time hard like this, they ended up after new times of new religions and new impositions came. But all this probably, I hope that the present period of being completely immersed by this ideologies instead of science will be shortly ended. And if I have one question, it will be if you can say more about the practices of auto-censorship. It was strong censura in those times, in some periods, and after we saw in 56 how it was ended for a short period, but what kind of changes took it. I would like to ask you this question: how much you had in your mind all the time this question, to what extent the people who read what you analyzed were under pressure of censura and they practiced autocensura. I don't know if it is clear, my question, but because what I miss the most from the historians or people who are analyzing historical text from that time and this area, they are frequently completely forgetting that they had very hard censorship, and the text were frequently several times corrected, negotiated. So this is not always something that these people thought entirely. It was the results of the negotiation. So thank you very much. And thank you for your work.
Thank you, Izabela. The next is Maciej. Maciej, the floor is yours, please.
Danke, Heidi. Well, I decided to make something like 3 main points dedicated rather to those of us who do not know the book. So I will not be speaking directly to Alexej, but to let's say part of the rest. But to make this a tad more dynamic, I would add a sentence a question to Alexej at the end of every of those points, and some of those questions, I must say, I must add now, clearly echo in a different way what Izabela wishes to hear from you. It says a lot about your success as a historian, as an author of a book, that your book raises similar questions among scholars of different disciplines. That is, I guess, quite an achievement. So let me start with this seemingly obvious question of time. As we all know, 1956 figures as the end date of Stalinism, while the beginnings of this period in Poland are situated more or less around 1949, which means that the whole project of Stalinization, albeit very ambitious, had no more than a couple of years to be introduced and to flourish. Such a short time span means, among other things, that Stalinism could not enjoy a monopolistic position even during those very years, even during this short time span between 1949 and, say, 1953 or 4. The logical conclusion would be to carefully examine alternative ideologies. Alexej follows this path very consequently, and thus offers a dynamic picture of a period that had been called schematism shortly afterwards. He convincingly proves that so-called national virtues never ceased to play the main role in the cultural life of post-war Poland. Thus, the objective of the progressive, let me now mark those quotation marks, intellectuals was to negotiate between them and this new situation. The question that arises from this conclusion is, what actors are at play there? How would you delineate divisions among all those intellectuals within such a short and dynamic period? There must have been a lot of conflict, a lot of groupings, and various interests. And I'm very curious to know more, and perhaps more openly than it is allowed in an academic publication. I would like to know your opinion about the role of gender, about the role of Jewishness in those debates, in those conflicts. That's something that makes your book very interesting. But since we are among us, so to say, you can perhaps say even more than you've written. So that would be my first point. The second is about the educational character of the Sovietization process. Here, Alexej walks in the footsteps of newer historiography, which stresses the active role of intellectuals within the Soviet bloc in designing local versions of the system. Alexej already mentioned it in his presentation. That is something that we intellectuals were expected to achieve together. There was no central committee that would decide which of the national traditions were to be deemed progressive, which not. That was precisely the task of the intellectuals themselves, to adjust to those non-specific expectations. Consequently, Sovietization was not about accepting a precisely designed set of assumptions beyond the basic credo of the Marxist-Leninist faith. It was about teaching people how to adapt to, more or less any turn of the ruling ideology, to teach them how to behave. let me add that this perspective makes the book a very universal tale, and here I echo what Izabela already mentioned. A tale of scholarly opportunism, potentially equally valid for the interpretation of the intellectuals' attitudes towards nationalist, populist power in the 21st century, as it's been proved to be for the Stalinist period. The question that arises here is, well, again, feel free, if I may say so, feel free to go beyond 1956 and say something about scripts or legacies that reappear afterwards. How universal is the model you describe? Are we still within the same model, or not? Or is there something else we are currently facing? How do you look at later developments? Now, finally, my third point is your, Alexej's, careful balancing between the criticism of the opportunist self-Sovietization. And here, if I may judge, that is my feeling from reading, Adam Schaff is perhaps the villain of this story. He gets very little sympathy from the author, I must add. And 𝗪𝗂𝗪 𝗪𝗶𝗪 is also not, he doesn't look very well here. But, it's the counterbalance is Alexej's understanding of the realities of the time. Alexej really never forgets to mention administrative punishments, other dangers surrounding academics, and he skillfully characterizes this atmosphere of fear that surrounded at least some of those intellectuals. Neither does he raise accusing finger nor exculpate everything. That is very, very nice, very good, very humane in a way. His judgment seems to me to be an organic mixture of profound knowledge and common sense, both to be admired by such a young scholar. Perhaps empathy would be a proper word here. But here again, and a question arises, namely, how would you characterize the historiography of your topic? Is there a shift in dealing with Stalinism, with this personal experience of Stalinization between the elder historiography from 1990s, say, like Rafał Stabiecki and so on, and those younger scholars? My intention is, there's slightly provocative question, isn't it so that when you read this older historiography, you sometimes come across people overemphasizing this fear, danger, and terror, whereas when you're reading the fresh, the newly published books and articles by the younger scholars, it might be that they slightly underemphasize this or simply ignore this context, which is, and perhaps you are the right person to ask this question because you seem to be somewhere in between, still, young in terms of age, but you are pretty old, I would say, in terms of life experience. Finally, I would like to highlight one more virtue of this book. It is really very well contextualized. Most of all, by bringing into the reader's attention the peculiarities of the Soviet model, Alexej sheds light on what made Polish scholars and intellectuals exceptionally difficult to discipline. as a Polish historian, I would really like to think that this non-virtue in well, in the understanding of your actually, so the vice will remain characteristic for the Polish academia and for Polish intellectuals for forever. But using this opportunity, having you here, I would like to ask a totally non-professional question. Is there a Polish specificity in terms of how this milieu or a mafiotic society, as John Connolly would put it, perhaps, really has its specificity, or is just a coincidence? It's a matter of time and proportion and there was various phases and various variants of public response to disciplining. They just travel around, and we can expect other things happen in the near future, or similar happen in other contexts. So those are my comments. And for question about mapping the social group, those intellectuals, delineating the factions within this group, question about the legacy or scripts existing, also like surviving, I think, this end of Stalin's period and perhaps functioning until today. And question about possible generational shift in the research. Well, and finally, tell me about how exceptional we Poles are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both, Maciej and Izabela, for your comments, and also thank you to Alexej for giving us the insights into the conception and the ideas of your book. So I'm quite sure that, Alexej, do you want to answer a bit? And then I'm sure that our audience wants to ask questions. Please, Alexej, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for your brilliant comments and for your brilliant questions. And I will try to react to some of them and probably to try to answer some of your questions. First of all, I will start with Izabela's comments and questions, and I just wanted to say that this example with genetics or 𝗕𝗁𝗁𝗪ism, for example, it is really a very brilliant example in which one can show how it works. And thank you very much for saying it. It is always very interesting experience if you meet a person who was working with similar sources and who really understand what you mean, what you are trying to say. And it is really not only in terms of this very general idea that there is a correct ideology of 𝗕𝗁𝗁𝗪ism and everybody and all scientists had to work in accordance with the new procedure, just because we have to be loyal to the interests of the working class, which is represented by this ideology and so on, but also how it worked in a context, how scientists and biologists resisted this kind of novelty and this kind of attempt to change the academic or scientific ethos, in fact, in the academic practice. I also really appreciate your remark regarding the interwar period. And that is also very important point why I was so interested in this period. And it was always one big reference, many references to these interwar debates, which are extremely interesting and under-researched and underestimated in their historiography, I would say, because the discussions that were led in Polish scientific journals in the interwar period, they are extremely interesting and innovative in terms of general, not only European, but also scientific debates in general. And I think that the fact that this very strict reflection about the role of academics or intellectuals and so on, and also on the social conditions of knowledge production was something that also couldn't be broken down in very short period with some theories which couldn't replace the theory that existed, that were developed in these circles. And that is in a sense a kind of breach to the your third point concerning the current situation, probably very different, so to say, attempts to the tendencies that seem to some people very similar to these campaigns of Stalinism. I think that really the thing that I really appreciated personally, if I may to make such a very personal remark, about the people like Katarbinsky or Jdukewicz or Asowski and Maria Asowska and brilliant women as a scholar who work in this period, is very reflexive approach to the social nature and social effects of knowledge and social conditions of knowledge production. So it is not this in other tendencies which we face today in academia, which I think is not less dangerous, like the claim of the absolute truth of scientific knowledge, which is, so to say, something that just has to rule the society, and to be a scientist, have a scientific approach and answer to all questions, and that is something that has nothing to do with social situation, and that is just the truth and so on. That is another side of this current struggle, probably, which I also wanted to mention or thematize. And I think that the people like those about whom I wrote this book were extremely reflective, also about Marxism, also about their very important message that Marx and Engels and you mentioned, for example, Hochfeld, who also developed in so-called new Marxism or liberalized Marxism and so on, who were very reflexive about also about the social conditions and their responsibility of or social effects of scientific knowledge. And I think that is really value, and that is a kind of discussion which was very important and still is very important. And also, if we try to reflect on this new development that you mentioned, I think that in German academia it works a bit differently, because I think that I feel rather more or less strong attempts in some sections of academia to suppress something idea of engaged scholarship as as a kind of value or an idea of gender as a kind of academic category, which is also important for analyzing social relations and power relations and so on. But that is the people we are talking about were very careful about this issue, very aware of these topics, and I think that is also a very important point. And thank you very much that you thematize this. Regarding the issues that Maciej mentioned, and some of them are also have to do with each other. I will just try to answer these questions. The first question has a lot to do with the issues which Izabela also thematized at the end. I thought in the beginning of my research, and it was partly a criticism of my approach, that this general methodological framework is not sensible for these issues like gender issues or this idea of the Jewish question and all this stuff, just because, especially in the context of the socialist or specific virtue that were promoted under Stalinism, there was an idea that they are general, they are universal, they had to be applied in any case. But I still think that just as a historian, I couldn't avoid also talking about brilliant women who participated in these debates. Or, for example, the Jewish question played a very important role. I will make a special comment on this some later. And I think that if we try to use all these methodological approaches in the context and to be aware of these contexts, it makes, of course, the whole picture much more complex. But we can see very unusual groups and fronts that also Maciej thematized. We can see that in some cases, we'll see Celina Babinska and Adam Schaff. I love Adam Schaff. I mean, it was my favorite figure, I would say. Just one reaction on your remark, Maciej. Adam Schaff and Celina Babinska, these people who were trained in the Soviet Union and knew how it should work, so to say, how it should be. In one camp, sometimes together with Żółkiewski, for example, the philologist, who was not that probably enthusiastic about these campaigns that he had to lead and so on. But on the other hand, in other camp, so to say, we can say also Maria Osowska or other scholars, and let's say Tadeusz Kotarbiński or Stanisław Wasowski in other group. We can see in some cases Halashinsky together with Schaff in this constellation, but some later, Halashinsky in their group, which will become later openly anti-Semitic and will attack Adam Schaff in a very anti-Semitic way. And this attack and this idea that Stalinism was brought by Jews like Adam Schaff and people made this topic central. Some later it became open, but it was there, and we can see it in the sources already on this period. So I think that it is again about this point that I attempted to deliver also in the book. It is very important to be aware of this context, and if we are careful and we are aware of these issues, we can just contribute also to this current debates on the general issues or this Jewish question or the mechanism of creating of fronts with the approach which is not probably which doesn't have it as a core approach or core research question and so on, but it is important. And I just wanted to say that this interesting constellation that I wouldn't notice perhaps if I worked differently and looked at different things are also value, and it is, so to say, something that was important for me. Regarding the long history, it is very interesting and kind of scripts. I think that this kind of 𝗕𝗁𝗪, I like to use this word, organization. I mean, I understand by that the fact that it was public. I mean, the fact that people could defend themselves publicly played a very important role also in the formation of young intellectuals who were participants of these events. Yeah, like for example, Zygmunt Bauman, yeah, who was a very young scholar at the time, and Izabela in her book also showed his later developments, intellectual developments in very important, very interesting way. And there are people who started to question their so to say their virtues that they were expected to promote and to propagate. And through the fact that these questions didn't receive proper answers, played a very important role in the later developments in how these academic conflicts worked in the 1968. Well, I can't say about all long stories that were discussed in the book, but just because we probably it would take too long. I think that the question with the anti-Semitic campaign of 1968 is a very good example of it. Anti-Zionist campaign of 1968 and the attack on Adam Schaff, which also didn't really work, an academic attack, didn't really work as a kind of purely academic discussion. There were party members who were also scholars, but who couldn't make this kind of discussion a kind of common sense in the academic field, and they didn't try it because they knew that they wouldn't succeed in it. These attacks were were conducted first of all in this this party context, but also the fact that police had to come to the university in 1968 and invade, and professors, by the way, also Adam Schaff and the communist professors defended their students. I spoke to some people have tried to write to all officials who and to defend, to find some position for the students who were expelled during this anti-Semitic or this campaign of the 1968. So this fact that this logic can describe how various groups were formed and how these corporations worked can be applied to the analyzing the later developments. And I think that some of the stories, as I mentioned at the end of my talk, have some effect till now, and it is also something that can be applied to not only to the Polish case but also to some others. The last point, the last question, I do think that I have also noticed the tendency that in some recent scholarship of Stalinism, not only in the case of Polish historiography, also in the case of other historiographies of this period, have this tendency just to ignore this repressive context, the context of fear and the context of repression. There are people who survive the war, and I try to say it by every occasion in the book. And there are people who just witness very bad things and who had to deal with a system which was repressive in its nature. On the one hand, I partly sympathize with the idea that one starts to avoid probably this polarization between the repressive communists and very liberal, so to say, the world of freedom, free market, and so on, which basically shaped the framework in which the historians, anti-communist historians of the 90s or the 90s worked. I sympathize with the tendency to question, so to say, this polarization or this two camps logic. But also I think that it is a very important thing to not to forget and to take into account this repressive element of this regime and the consequences of some ideologies and ideas that were promoted by the people, and most of them were aware of the consequence of human losses and the consequences of their political, their ideologies. It is a very important thing. So everything that I can do, I'm not going to teach anyone how to write history or re-educate the youth or something like that. That is not my task and my ambition. But everything I can do, I can just support the tendencies that I find good and important, and criticize those that I think are not good or some dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexej, for your extensive answer to the comments. We are running out of time, so I just want to ask our audience, do you have any questions? Andre? You mustn't, but I saw that you switched on the camera, so. Okay.
Yeah, that's true, but perhaps someone else have some questions.
Nobody is obliged to ask. If not, we're just 20 minutes too late. The book launch was scheduled for 1 hour, so it was really interesting to listen to your comments and the answers and the conception of the book. But I think it is fine when we are now finishing our book launch. Thank you to you three for discussing, and thank you for the audience to come. Thank you, and see you again, and have a nice day.